Hi there. I'm going to spend a little time today talking you through some major elements of Iran's foreign relations, and I will also cover the current issues section of your textbook pertaining to Iran's nuclear program. I'm going to start by trying to outline just a couple of the basic principles that I think underlie Iran's approach to foreign policy. Although you will note that some of these principles don't necessarily correspond completely to its actual actions in foreign policy, and some of them aren't 100% consistent with each other. Nonetheless, I think we can identify a few different themes. Starting with a really strong sense of nationalism, of independence, Iran's leaders, I should say, have articulated the idea that their political model is unique, that it is superior, that it represents a really important innovation, and that it's important for them to defend Iran's independence against any kind of foreign interference. In particular, it's not uncommon to hear the supreme leader claim that the United States and sometimes other Western powers are trying to overthrow Iran's regime and trying to meddle in its politics, for instance, through endorsing a particular candidate in elections, or at least speaking favorably about a candidate, through imposing economic sanctions, and through the United States' various interventions elsewhere in the Middle East. In the immediate aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, there was this kind of wave of optimism among Iran's political leadership that the Iranian Revolution had established this new model of an Islamic republic, which would really take the rest of the Muslim world by storm, and which in particular would catch on in neighboring predominantly Muslim countries elsewhere in the Middle East. For reasons I'll talk about in a moment, that didn't really pan out, but even after it became obvious that other countries were not just going to copy paste Iran's political model post 1979, Iran has continued to try and expand its regional influence, and in particular to wield some degree of political influence in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and increasingly in Syria. Iran has been fairly persistently skeptical of American interference, as I've said, and that in turn that extended to criticism of United States nation building efforts in Afghanistan and in Iraq under the George W. Bush administration and after. Iran has made a number of claims to be protecting Shiite minorities in other predominantly Sunni countries, and sometimes will engage in international interventions, for instance, by claiming to say, we are protecting a really important Shiite shrine, or we are standing up for the rights of an oppressed Shiite minority in some other country. Finally, particularly the clerical side of Iran's leadership, has been persistently hostile to the existence of Israel. In general, they deny that Israel is a legitimate state. They criticize its policies, its perceived oppression of the Palestinians and occupation of what should be rightfully Palestinian territory. And in practice, Iran has lent material support to a variety of militant groups that launch violent attacks against Israel. It's worth remembering that for basically all of these points, you will sometimes see disagreement between the clergy versus elected leaders. But that and that it's the president is nominally in charge of foreign policy in Iran, but the supreme leader's policy pronouncements matter a lot in terms of shaping foreign policy, particularly given the supreme leader's influence with and popularity among the Revolutionary Guard and the security services more generally. So, a couple of tools. I'll talk in a second about tools that Iran uses to project its power in the region. But first, just a couple of notes on why the Islamic Revolution did not, in fact, spread beyond Iran. Number one, sectarian differences. Iran is officially Shia Muslim, but most Muslims in the world are Sunnis. And so that specific religious ideology underlying the model of jurist guardianship doesn't necessarily copy paste very effectively into non Shia countries. Number two is ethnic differences. As we've already said, Iran is predominantly Persian in ethnicity, but the surrounding countries that could potentially adopt the model of the Iranian Revolution are mostly ethnically Arab. And so there are some linguistic and ethnic differences there as well. Finally, Iran, shortly after the revolution, was immediately plunged into this devastating, almost decade-long war with Iraq. And that led a lot of Iranian leaders, both on the clerical and the secular side, to articulate an extremely nationalistic view, to highlight the importance of an Iranian identity, and to use these ideas of nationalism and patriotism to recruit its own population to join the war. Shiites in Iraq, despite being ruled under a non-Shiite governments, did not at that time defect en masse to the Iranian side. Many of them rallied under the rubric of nationalism rather than religious solidarity. And so that too helped kind of cement these dividing lines between Iran and the surrounding Muslim world. That said, Iran continues to try and exercise influence in its region, and I'll just talk you through a couple of different tools that Iran has used. The first term that's important to know here is the Quds Force, Quds meaning Jerusalem, which is a branch of the Revolutionary Guard that is responsible for various operations outside of Iran. If you have heard of the Quds Force outside of this class, it is likely because in January 2020, the United States launched an airstrike that killed the Quds Force commander, a guy named Qasem Soleimani, and that raised for a moment some fears of significantly escalated tensions, potentially even more, between the United States and Iran. One of the things that the Quds Force does on a day-to-day basis is provide support, provide weapons, provide financing, provide training to a variety of militant groups, such as Hamas in Palestine and Hezbollah in Lebanon, which are unified, among other things, by their support by their active opposition to what they view as the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and often launch violent attacks against Israel, and against Israeli settlements. Um, it's worth noting, by the way, that not all of these groups are Shiite. Hamas, in particular, is a predominantly Sunni group, and so that idea of protecting the Shia minority is not the sole defining characteristic of which groups Iran decides to support. Number three, Iran also gets politically involved, even beyond its support for violent intervention, in a variety of regional conflicts. So, for instance, the Iranians have expressed some open support for some political candidates in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And it's just worth noting that American interventions in those countries have kind of created an opportunity for Iran to gain political influence in the absence of the previously existing regime. Finally, more recently, Iran has invested significantly in cyber warfare. Their government has reportedly sponsored hacks against oil and gas companies that operate in the Persian Gulf, and they maintain a fairly active cyber warfare and cyber espionage program. Finally, the thing that you have probably been waiting for me to talk about for this entire unit, and I'm sorry that I'm just getting to it now, Iran's nuclear program. I'm going to start with something that I'm not really qualified to do and try and tell you a tiny bit of science. So, generating energy from uranium, whether to turn lights on or to make a giant explosion, requires an activity called enrichment, in which you separate out different uranium isotopes from each other by spinning them in devices called centrifuges. Hopefully, I'm not giving you enough information here to go build your own nuclear weapon. Civilian peaceful nuclear energy, which is legal under international law, requires some degree of uranium enrichment. Developing nuclear weapons, which for Iran is illegal under international law, requires a much higher degree of enriching uranium. But you have to do some amount of the same thing in order to make energy versus in order to make a nuclear weapon. And so there's some difficulty in distinguishing between whether Iran is enriching uranium for legal energy generation purposes or for more concerning military purposes. In order to develop a nuclear weapon, Iran would need to enrich a bunch of uranium to that very high weapons grade, develop a weapon that could fit onto a missile that would actually be able to fly, and develop missiles powerful enough to reach a target. And Iran has not yet done all three of those things, but it made pretty active investments in developing a military nuclear capacity in the 1990s and 2000s. And so the rest of the world got increasingly concerned about this. As I've said, one international response to Iran's development of a nuclear weapon was economic sanctions by the United States, by the European Union, by the United Nations. A second was a variety of covert actions that intended to spy on and ultimately sabotage Iran's nuclear program. Notably, a few years ago, there was a computer worm called Stuxnet that was probably developed by Israel and the United States jointly that infiltrated Iran's nuclear facilities and actually succeeded in disabling something like 20% of its centrifuges. And then finally, more recently, there's been some news of targeted assassinations against Iranian nuclear scientists on Iranian soil. And the speculation is that these are most likely acts by Israeli intelligence, Israel having a pretty obvious reason to be concerned if Iran does develop a military nuclear capacity. That said, perhaps the most politically notable response to Iran's nuclear program is an attempt to negotiate them out of it. And that led to what is colloquially known as the nuclear deal, what is technically called the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was first signed in 2015, although there's a temporary deal along similar lines first reached in 2013. The backstory to this is that the permanent five members of the Security Council, so China, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, plus Germany, joined along to negotiate with Iran a basic deal in which Iran would agree to limit its enrichment of weapons and to admit international inspectors to verify its compliance. And in exchange, those other countries would agree to lift the sanctions on Iran. And there's a lot of detail, of course, that I'm glossing over. There's plenty of resources online if you want to know about the nitty gritty details. But the basic goal here was not to completely destroy Iran's capacity to enrich uranium. In particular, Iran's supposed to be able to continue enriching uranium for energy generation purposes, but rather to just reduce what's known as the breakout time, which is how many months or years it would take for Iran to go from deciding it wanted to create a nuclear weapon to enriching enough uranium to actually have a nuclear weapon. So the constraints to which Iran agreed were somewhat limited. Notably, a lot of Americans were upset that this deal did not affect Iran's development of ballistic missiles and did not affect Iran's financing of militant groups elsewhere in the Middle East. But the general agreement was that this would have slowed down, this deal would have, and in fact, for a time, did slow down Iran's ability to actually create a nuclear weapon. That deal was, it turns out, only in force for 2 or 3 years. It was negotiated and implemented under the Obama administration, but Donald Trump came to office in the United States saying, this was a bad deal, I'm going to pull us out of it. And indeed, in 2018, Donald Trump withdrew the United States unilaterally from the nuclear deal and then proceeded to reimpose sanctions. This is not, it's worth noting, because Iran broke its obligations or failed substantially to comply with what it had said it would do with the parameters of that agreement. It's simply because Trump said, this is a bad deal and we never should have made it. Joe Biden's stance under the current administration is that the deal should be restored, but negotiations are very much up in the air. And so one thing to watch out for if you're interested in the future of Iran's both nuclear program and economy is what happens if there is an attempt to restart negotiations or to lift sanctions and induce Iran back into compliance with this deal. That's it. I'll leave it there. Thanks.